How far will your money go in Mexico?
Yo no me atrevo a bailar arriba de esa tarima. Yo no me atrevo a bailar arriba de esa
Welcome to another episode of Everything Mexico. I am your host, Richard. A shocking statistic is that the median household income in Mexico is about $5,000 per year. This is household income, not individual income. The median individual income is only about $3,000 per year. It can be ascertained from these statistics that even if you have a low income in your home country in dollars or euros, you will do quite well in Mexico. Chatting with fellow soldiers in the Army years ago, I asked each one of them why they had signed up for military service. They all said it was to get a better paying job. The conversation started to focus on life in Mexico. I singled out one of the soldiers and began to ask him questions. I asked him if he'd had a car before he joined the military, and he said he'd had a Honda Civic. So then I asked him where he'd lived. In an apartment, he replied. Did you have heating in your apartment? I asked. Sure, he said. Did you have AC? Yes, he responded. Did you have a refrigerator? I was asking obvious questions on purpose to get to a point. Even a poor American has a refrigerator, AC in their house, and they generally have a car. Cars and vehicles in general are a good topic of conversation to start off on to talk about money in Mexico. Vehicle sales worldwide say a lot about a country's money situation. For many Mexicans, it is a dream for them to get their first car, and it takes a lot of work to make that dream come true. And when they do get that new car, it's almost certainly not going to be a new Honda Civic, Toyota Camry, or F-150. Their first car will generally be a used car costing somewhere between $2,000 to $5,000. For many Mexicans, their first mode of motorized transportation will be a motorcycle. Mexico manufactures Italica and Vento motorcycles that can be purchased new for about $1,500. They are low quality, but while they break down frequently, they are inexpensive to repair and inexpensive to run. Another statistic that can help us understand money in Mexico better is that the most sold car countrywide is the Nissan Versa. It sells for about $20,000, and last year they sold 48,000 units. In the United States, the most sold vehicle was the Ford F-150, selling about 650,000 units at an average price of about $60,000. To compare apples to apples, the Ford F-150 is the most desirable pickup truck in Mexico, and Mexicans like pickup trucks, yet it sold only 11,500 units in 2022. These numbers help us to see that incomes in Mexico are quite small. Mexico has a population of 130 million, while the United States has a population of 330 million. While the United States has a population about 2/3 larger than Mexico, 98% more Ford F-150s were sold there. There are 3 Americans for every 1 Mexican, yet for every 48 F-150s sold in the U.S., 1 was sold in Mexico. My first job in Mexico was as a moralero. A moralero is the person who empties the net baskets that the cutters lower down from the trees into boxes and onto trucks. I made 60 pesos a day, which at the time, with the 10 peso to $1 exchange rate, was $6. I had ample time during that job to philosophize about the fact that I was making as much money in one day. Let's step back in time for a moment. Oh, monkey's back. Hello, monkey. Huh? Yeah. Oye, chamoco. Yeah. Okay, buddy. Perfectly adapted to tree life, aren't you? That job to philosophize about the fact that I was making as much money in one day in the mango orchards in 14 minutes at my previous job. Now, if there is something that will teach you about the realities of Mexico, that will teach you a lot. I had decided to travel through Latin America on my bicycle and work along the way so that I could truly understand the region. It was completely of my own volition that I was making so little money. Working in the very high humidity on the Pacific coast of Chiapas for just $6 a day was extremely important in helping me understand the reality of many Mexicans. I was working for what was a very normal wage. I worked in the mango orchard until the end of the mango season, and during that time, it became very apparent why everybody knew somebody from their community who was working in the United States. To understand income and the value of money, it is extremely important to understand the cost of living. How much can you purchase with the money that you make? Well, back in 2006, when I was working in the mango orchards, $6 a day was enough money to buy rice, tortilla, beans, your staple foods to keep your stomach full, but not much else. Most foreigners tend to visit Cancun, parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, perhaps Los Cabos in Baja California, Mazatlan, Puerto Vallarta, and those places are culturally and economically quite different from the rest of Mexico. In Cancun, it's easy to spend 25, 30, 40, 50 bucks on a meal and 150 bucks for a hotel. Because the majority of visitors to those places are Americans, Canadians, mingled with some Europeans who are on a 1 to 4 week vacation, they tend to charge prices that are more on par with what those people are used to paying, not the prices that Mexicans can afford. The result is that many foreigners only see the pricier side of Mexico. Going to those places, you might never really see how affordable most of Mexico really is and just how much purchasing power your dollars, euros, or pounds give you. Taking into account the cost of living in Mexico compared to the rest of North America and Europe, we can safely say that the purchasing power of Europeans, Americans, and Canadians is about 13 times more than the purchasing power of Mexicans with their peso. I'd like to take a moment to ask you to subscribe and give us a thumbs up if you're enjoying the Everything Mexico channel. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, we'll leave a link in the description below. It really helps us out. It wasn't until I started working and living in Mexico that I learned to manage money well. This is simply because the scarcer a resource, the better care you take of it. In the United States, I knew I could go many places and make good money, so I wasn't particularly worried about it. When I first pedaled through Mexico, I knew almost no one in the country, and my savings were slowly disappearing. After my stint in the mango orchard, I realized the best way to make money in Mexico was to run your own business, like so many Mexicans do. Many Mexicans run their own businesses, making and selling tamales in the street, putting up a food stand outside their house, cleaning windshields at a traffic light, selling fruit to people going by in cars. Mexicans are very entrepreneurial. If they can't find a job or want to make more money and have more flexibility than they would as an employee, they often find something to make, start making it, and take off running with it. Because many Mexicans have been working in the family business since they were youngsters, they are not shy about selling you things or approaching you in the street with their products and services. But even if you are self-employed, your income will be relatively low compared to other parts of North America and Europe. My first self-employment job was as a tour guide. I'd look for foreigners who needed an English-speaking tour guide, wanted a driver and a vehicle, and I would provide them with touring, interpreting, and driving services. I made on average 400 pesos a day, which back in 2006, 2007 was about $40 a day. That's a huge step up from $6 a day in the orchard, but still not a salary for someone to brag about in the wealthier countries. Generally speaking, working with foreigners like I was in the tourist industry is much better paid than work where there are no foreigners. Large numbers of Mexicans leave home to find work along the Riviera Maya in the Yucatan, Baja California, and other places where there are a lot of tourists. A foreign tourist thinks nothing of leaving a $10 tip at a restaurant or for a driver, and for many Mexicans, that represents a full day's work. A French or English tourist thinks little of spending, $40 for a guided boat tour. Yet that $40 can be 2 days' wages or maybe even more for many people. The first time I dropped off a couple at a high-end hotel and they paid $250 for the first night, it was a healthy reminder of just how much money people make in certain countries. I was making about $40 a day and spending about half of that to live a very modest lifestyle. At the time, I was living in a tent I had set up in a pavilion on a friend's property. I would take tourists to my friend's home where they made tapetes, tapestries, and rugs, and sometimes the tourists would purchase things from them, and in this way I would make myself more economically useful to the family. For me to spend $250 for one night at a hotel would have been economically ridiculous or not even viable because it represented 10 days of savings at a 50% savings rate. And yet my economic reality was not nearly as harsh as the economic reality for many Mexicans. It is truly no wonder why so many Mexicans and Latin Americans are willing to cross the border into the United States illegally and often risk their lives to do so. In a few years, at a low-paying job in the United States, you can make your dreams come true that may have taken you a lifetime in Mexico to accomplish, even if you were smart and highly motivated. Years ago, I was working at a staffing company in Colorado, and one of our best employees died in an accident on a snow-covered highway in his free time. The companies that he had worked for donated money to his family, and I decided to take a trip to Mexico City to deliver this money. Prior to his death, he had been making about $10 an hour and was living in an apartment with a few other people who were also immigrant workers. During the time that I knew him, I often imagined that his family was doing quite well in Mexico because he was very hardworking, very family-oriented, constantly sending money home, and I saw the sacrifice that he was making. Arriving in Mexico City to meet his wife, I saw his house, and I was shocked at how humble his home was. His house was no more than 500 square feet and was scantily furnished. The divisions between the rooms were curtains. It had a bed, a stove, a sofa, a kitchen table with chairs, but not much else. And yet, his family was much better off than they had been prior to him going to the United States. And the money that we delivered to his wife, while a small sum in the United States, represented a large sum of money to her. This is the reality that many Mexicans face. They may live with their parents and make a living with humble wages, or they may decide to go farther afield, and for many of them, that means going to the United States illegally. Going legally to the United States is impossible for most of them, but we'll talk about why that's so in a future episode. Tech products in Mexico tend to cost the same or even be slightly more expensive than these same products would be in wealthier markets like you would find in the United States, Canada, and Europe. For example, you will pay a bit more for the same smartphone in Mexico. Many used vehicles in Mexico will cost you more than the same used vehicle in other markets. Foreigners in Mexico often love their stay here and comment on how inexpensive and wonderful it is. It is only inexpensive to those who possess currencies that give such favorable exchange rates. Currently, 1 euro is about 19 pesos, and 1 US dollar is about 17 pesos. Imagine for a moment that these values were switched, and 1 euro would give you 1/19th of a peso, and $1 would give you 1/17th of a peso. That would be terrible for those who possess those currencies. Well, that is the situation that Mexicans face when they want to travel to many other countries. That is why you seldom see Mexicans traveling abroad, despite the fact that their country has a population of 130 million. Yet you often see Germans, Brits, and Canadians that come from countries with much smaller populations. Before we stray too far from the topic of this episode, let's go back to the question, how far will your money go in Mexico? If you are watching this video as a native English speaker, You can be almost certain that your money will go a long way because you are privileged to come from a country with a strong currency. You Europeans will find the euro to be very strong here too. If you choose to travel outside the major tourist centers, prices will be from 100% to 400% less. You can easily live in Mexico on $1,000 or 900 euros a month. As a traveler who's moving around a lot, staying at hotels and eating out, you can comfortably travel on $2,000 a month or about 1,800 euros. So I hope you have a much better understanding of how far your money will go in Mexico. Our next episode will discuss what motivates millions of Mexicans to leave their homeland and make the often perilous journey to the United States. If you have any topics you would like me to cover regarding Mexico, please put them in the comment section below. Thank you for watching Everything Mexico, and we'll see you in the next episode.